Today on Forgotten Aircraft. The Caproni Ca.60. The Caproni Ca.60 Transero, often referred to as the Nova Plano for its 9 wings, was the prototype of a large flying boat intended to become a 100-passenger transatlantic airliner. Its designer, Gianni Caproni, and founder of the Caproni Aircraft Company, became famous during the First World War, especially in the field of heavy multi-engine bombers. In 1913, when Caproni was 27, he said that aircraft with a capacity of 100 and more passengers would soon become a reality. After the end of the First World War, Caproni began designing a huge and ambitious passenger flying boat. The idea of a large, multi-engine flying boat designed for carrying passengers on long-range flights was considered, at the time, rather eccentric. Caproni thought, however, that such an aircraft could allow the travel to remote areas more quickly than ground or water transport. He affirmed that his large flying boat could be used on any route, within a nation or internationally, and he considered operating it in countries with large territories and poor transport infrastructures such as China. Caproni believed that to attain these objectives, rearranging wartime aircraft would not be sufficient. On the contrary, he thought that a new generation of airliners featuring extended range and increased payload capacity, the latter in turn allowing a reduction in cost per passenger, had to supersede the converted leftovers from the war. In spite of criticism from some important figures in Italian aviation, especially aerial warfare theorist Giulio Douhet, Caproni started designing the Ca.60 in 1919. Aware of the safety problems connected to passenger flights, those concerns being the root of Douhet's criticism, Caproni concentrated on both improving the aircraft's reliability and minimizing the damage that could be caused by possible accidents. He conceived this large seaplane as a multi-engine aircraft featuring enough motors to allow it to keep flying even in case of the failure of one or more of them. The Model 3000, or Trans-Aero, began construction in the second half of 1919. In September, an air fair took place at the Caproni factory in Toledo, not far from Milan, during which the new ambitious project was heavily publicized. Later, in September, Caproni experimented with the Caproni Ca.4 seaplane to improve his calculations for the Trans-Aero. At the end of 1920, the construction yard was visited by United States Ambassador to Italy, Robert Underwood Johnson, who said he admired Caproni's exceptional aircraft. The press affirmed that the Ca.60 would be ready to begin test flights in January 1921. Were the tests successful, Italy would swiftly gain international supremacy in the field of civil aerial transport. On January 10, 1921, the forward engines and nacelles were tested, and no dangerous vibrations were recorded. And on January 12th, 2 of the aft engines were also successfully tested. The Ca.60 was powered by the most powerful engines produced during the First World War. The Liberty L-12 V12 engines built in the United States were capable of producing 400 horsepower each. Arranged in 2 groups of 4 engines each, one group at the foremost wing set and one at the aftmost wing set, each group featured a central nacelle containing 2 engines in a push-pull configuration. To either side were single-engine nacelles. All nacelles had radiators for the cooling liquid. The 2 central nacelles also housed open-air cockpits for 1 flight engineer each. Receiving orders from the central cockpit, each flight engineer controlled the power output of their 4 engines via a complex system of lights and indicators located on electrical panels. The cockpit was open air and positioned above and slightly behind the forward windows. One of the most important seaplane designers of the time, Alessandro Guidoni, was commissioned by Caproni to create the hull and floats, and the 2 small hydrofoils located close to the nose of the aircraft. The Trans-Aero left its hangar for the first time on January 20th, 1921. Due to the low level of the lake, there were issues with the slipway that connected the hangar to the water's edge. The slipway was lengthened on January 24th and then again on the 28th. The Tranzero was finally put in the water and its engines were running smoothly. It started taxiing across the surface of the lake, and the pilot, Federico Semprini, a former military flight instructor who was known for having once looped a Caproni Ca.60 heavy bomber, would be the test pilot for subsequent trials of the Tranzero. Caproni expected the Tranzero to be very stable in the pitch axis because of the tandem triplane configuration. He said that the huge aircraft could be flown with just one hand on the controls. More taxiing tests were successfully carried out, and the bow of the aircraft was loaded with 660 pounds of ballast. The Tranzero reached the speed of 50 miles per hour, or 43 knots, and took off for the first time. During the brief flight, it proved stable and maneuverable in spite of a persisting tendency to climb. On March 4th, the second flight took place, and Semprini, the test pilot, later recalled that he accelerated to 68 miles per hour, or 59 knots, pulling the yoke toward himself, and suddenly the Tranzero took off and started climbing in a sharp nose-up attitude. Semprini reduced the throttle, but then the aircraft's tail started falling and the aircraft lost altitude, out of control. The tail soon hit the water and was rapidly followed by the nose of the aircraft, which slammed into the surface, breaking the forepart of the hull. The fore wing set collapsed in the water together with the nose of the aircraft, while the central and aft wing sets, together with the tail of the aircraft, kept floating. The pilot and the flight engineers escaped the wreck unscathed. The wreck of the Tranzero was towed to the shore after the accident on March 4, 1921. Caproni was delayed coming by automobile, and only arrived at the shore of Lake Maggiore after the Tranzero had crashed. He later said, "So the fruit of years of work, an aircraft that was to form the basis of future aviation, all is lost in a moment. But one must not be shocked if one wants to progress. The path of progress is strewn with suffering." At the time, the accident was blamed on two concurrent causes. First, the wake of a steamboat may have interfered, as it was navigating nearby where the Tranzero was accelerating. The steamboat pictured here may be the very one which interfered with the Ca.60's takeoff. Second, Semprini, the test pilot, was blamed for continuously pulling the yoke and trying to gain altitude when he should have performed corrective maneuvers, such as lowering the nose to let the massive aircraft gain speed. More recent theories have concluded that the probable cause of the accident was probably the sandbags that had been placed in the aircraft to simulate the weight of passengers. They were not fastened to the seats, and it's very likely they may have slid to the back of the fuselage when upon takeoff the Tranzero suddenly pitched up. With the tail burdened by the additional load and a shift in the center of gravity, the aircraft would have become uncontrollable as the nose lifted more and more until the Tranzero stalled and violently hit the water tail first. Today, the only surviving fragments of the Ca.60 are the outriggers and a section of the lower front of the main hull, on display at the Gianni Caproni Museum of Aeronautics. Caproni discussed with the General of Aeronautics in Ivano Bonomi, who had been the Ministry of War until shortly before, the possibility of building a 1/3 scale model, and Bonomi promised that, had he won the elections, his cabinet would grant him all the financial support he needed. However, even though Bonomi actually became Prime Minister in July, more urgent political priorities ultimately caused the project of the Tranzero to be abandoned. Although the Caproni Ca.60 was ultimately not successful, to this day it is still considered one of the most extraordinary aircraft ever built.